I stood in the pouring rain, staring at the front door of the house I used to own. 3 years. 3 years in a military correctional facility for a crime I didn't commit. A setup so flawless it destroyed my career and my name. Every single day behind bars, the thought of my husband, the one person who promised to wait for me, was the only thing that kept me sane. But as I reached for the doorknob, the lock clicked open from the inside. There he stood, holding a glass of wine, wearing the smile I had missed for over 1,000 nights. But his smile froze, turning into pure horror. And then a voice called out from our bedroom. A voice I knew better than my own. It was my best friend. The very woman who had wept the loudest at my sentencing. They thought I was broken. They thought I was gone forever. They had no idea that my lawyer was already on the phone, waiting for my signal. I looked them both in the eye, dialed the number and whispered 4 words. Your time is up. My name is Olivia Vance. I am 28 years old, and until recently my life was defined by the crisp lines of a military uniform, the strict adherence to a code of honor, and a career in military intelligence that I had spent my entire adult life building. But 3 years ago that reality was violently stripped away from me. I was court-martialed, convicted, and locked inside a military correctional facility for a high-level logistics data leak. A crime I absolutely did not commit. For over 1,000 days I stared at concrete walls, surviving entirely on the memory of my husband David and my best friend Clara. They were the 2 pillars I believed were holding my world together outside. David's letters had slowly tapered off to nothing over the last year, which I chalked up to the painful burden of my absence. I told myself he was hurting too much to write. I told myself that once I proved my innocence, we would pick up right where we left off. When the High Court finally threw out my conviction due to newly uncovered anomalies in the digital evidence, I chose not to call them. I wanted to surprise David. I wanted to walk through our front door, drop my bags and feel his arms around me without the sterile glare of a prison visitation room. But life, I quickly learned, doesn't pause just because you are trapped behind bars. The rain was coming down in sheets when the taxi dropped me off at the edge of the circular driveway. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. The neat hedges, the warm porch light casting a golden glow against the dark evening. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I walked up the steps, my fingers trembling as I reached for the brass doorknob. Before I could even pull my old key from my pocket, the lock clicked. The door swung inward. There stood David. He was wearing a soft cashmere sweater I had bought him for our last anniversary, holding a half-empty glass of red wine. The relaxed, peaceful smile on his face instantly froze the moment his eyes landed on me. It was a look of absolute, unadulterated horror, as if a ghost had just materialized on his welcome mat. His knuckles turned white around the stem of his wine glass. "Olivia?" he whispered, his voice cracking, stepping back instinctively as if trying to shield the inside of the house from my view. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be..." "I'm free, David," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside me. I stepped past him into the foyer, wiping the rain from my face. The conviction was overturned. "Aren't you happy to see me?" Before he could stammer out a response, the soft click of heels sounded against the hardwood floor coming from the direction of our master bedroom. "David, babe, who is at the door this late?" The voice sliced through the quiet house like a razor blade. It was Clara, my best friend, the woman who had held my hand during the early days of the investigation, who had sobbed lay out in the courtroom when the judge read my sentence, and who had promised to look after David while I was gone. She walked into the hallway wearing a silk robe that I recognized instantly because it had been a gift from David to me. Clara stopped dead in her tracks, her jaw dropping as she stared at me. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the walls. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating, and entirely damning. In that single frozen second, the puzzle pieces of the last 3 years instantly locked into place. The sudden accusations, the flawless digital trail that framed me, the way David easily secured my power of attorney over our bank accounts in this very house. It wasn't a tragic mistake. It was a perfectly executed plan. They hadn't just moved on. They had orchestrated my erasure so they could inherit everything I worked for. They thought I was a broken, disgraced former officer with nowhere left to turn. They thought I would cry, scream, or beg for an explanation. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I had memorized the day my release papers were signed. David took a step forward, his hands shaking as he tried to put on a face of false concern. "Olivia, listen, it's not what it looks like. We can explain." I ignored him entirely, holding the phone to my ear as the call connected on the very first ring. Marcus Thorne, my new defense attorney, answered immediately. I kept my eyes locked onto the panicked faces of my husband and my best friend, leaning against the doorframe as I whispered 4 quiet words into the receiver. "Your time is up." To understand how I ended up standing in my own foyer staring at my husband and best friend, you have to go back 3 years. At 25, I was a captain in military intelligence, stationed at the Regional Command Center. My job involved managing highly sensitive logistics data, tracking supply movements, and ensuring that strategic resources were exactly where they needed to be. I took immense pride in my work, spending long hours in secure rooms, meticulously double-checking every log and digital transfer. My record was flawless. Off-duty, my life revolved around David and Clara. Clara had been my closest confidant since our college days, the person I shared every secret with, while David was the man I had happily married after 2 years of dating. Our home was filled with laughter, shared dinners, and plans for a future family. I trusted them implicitly, never imagining that the 2 people closest to my heart were quietly observing the details of my career with a dark, calculating envy. The nightmare began on a Tuesday morning. I was at my desk reviewing routine shipping manifests when 2 grim-faced officers from the Criminal Investigation Division entered my office. Without warning, they informed me that I was being placed under arrest for espionage and the unauthorized transmission of classified military logistics data to an offshore server. I was completely stunned. I laughed at first, assuming it was a bureaucratic mistake or an incredibly tasteless joke. But the seriousness in their eyes told a different story. Within hours, I was escorted out of the building in handcuffs, stripped of my security clearance, and placed in a holding cell. The evidence against me was catastrophic. Investigators had discovered a series of encrypted files containing restricted operational logs, all sent directly from my personal laptop using my secure military digital signature. The digital footprint left no room for doubt. It pointed squarely at me. During the intense interrogations that followed, I sat in cold, windowless rooms, desperately trying to explain that I had never seen those files before. I had no idea how they got onto my computer, let alone how my private encryption key had been used to authorize the transmission. Every defense I offered sounded weak against the overwhelming weight of the forensic data. I was trapped in a web of numbers and codes I couldn't explain. When I was allowed my single phone call, I immediately dialed David, sobbing as I told what was happening. His voice on the other end sounded shocked and overwhelmed, promising that he and Clara would do whatever it took to support me. Clara even visited me in the detention facility, holding my hands through the glass, her eyes red from crying as she whispered that they would fight for me until the very end. But as the days rolled into weeks leading up to the official court-martial, the reality of my isolation began to set in. The military prosecutors were relentless, painting me as a disgruntled officer who had compromised national security for personal gain. I watched my defense team struggle to find any alternative explanation for the digital trail. The evidence was simply too clean, too perfect, as if someone had meticulously planned every single step to ensure there was absolutely no way out for me. Sitting in that military courtroom, stripped of my rank and dignity, I felt completely helpless. I looked back at the gallery, drawing strength from David and Clara's presence, genuinely believing they were my only lifelines in a world that had suddenly turned completely hostile. I had no idea that the digital trap had been forged from inside my own home, utilizing my own personal devices while I slept soundly in my bed. The day of my court-martial was a blur of cold formalities and heavy silences. I sat at the defense table, my chest tight as the military prosecutor laid out their case with ruthless precision. The digital evidence was presented on large screens, each line of code feeling like a nail in the coffin of my career. But the true betrayal didn't come from the prosecution's forensic experts. It came during the witness testimonies. When Clara took the stand, she looked fragile, her voice trembling as she answered the prosecutor's questions. She testified about my long hours, my occasional complaints about the high-stress environment, and most damagingly, a fabricated conversation where she claimed I had expressed frustration over my financial limitations. She spun it beautifully, making it sound like she was reluctantly admitting details out of a duty to the truth. Her tears looked so real that even my own defense lawyers seemed swayed by her apparent heartbreak. David's performance was equally calculated. While he didn't testify directly against me, his actions outside the courtroom spoke volumes. In the weeks leading up to the final verdict, he convinced me that we needed to protect our shared assets from potential government seizures or legal fees. Blinded by fear and my absolute trust in him, I willingly signed the power of attorney documents he placed in front of me during our brief visitation windows. I truly believed he was safeguarding our future, ensuring that our home and savings would be secure until I could clear my name. In reality, I was handing him the keys to my entire life, giving him the legal authority to erase me from the financial equation completely. When the judge finally pronounced me guilty and sentenced me to a lengthy term in the correctional facility, I looked back at them one last time, completely unaware that their tears were actually a celebration of their total victory. Life inside the military correctional facility was an endless cycle of gray walls, strict routines, and suffocating isolation. The transition from an respected intelligence officer to a prisoner with a number stamped on her uniform was a brutal shock to my system. In the beginning, the sheer injustice of my situation threatened to consume me entirely. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling of my cramped cell, replaying every moment of the investigation, trying to find the missing piece of the puzzle. My only comfort during those dark, lonely months was the stack of letters David sent. Every word he wrote was a lifeline, filled with empty promises of fighting for my release and keeping our home ready for my return. I read them until the ink faded, clinging to his devotion like an anchor in the storm. But as the first year bled into the second, the letters began to change. They grew shorter, less frequent, and stripped of the warmth they once possessed. Eventually, the incoming mailbox stayed completely empty. When I tried to call home during my limited phone privileges, the line rang out indefinitely, or went straight to a disconnected recording. The agonizing silence was worse than the prison walls. I told myself he was just overwhelmed, that the strain of my disgrace was too heavy for him to bear alone. I imagined him sitting in our living room, broken by grief, struggling to cope with the reality of a wife behind bars. My heart broke for him, entirely unaware that he wasn't mourning at all. It was during the final year of my sentence that the crushing despair finally gave way to something else. The numbness that had carried me through the daily monotony began to lift, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I realized that crying in the dark wouldn't change my fate, and relying on the outside world was only keeping me weak. If I was going to survive this and reclaim my life, I had to stop acting like a victim. I began spending every free hour in the facility's legal library, studying military law, digital forensics, and appellate procedures. I trained my mind to become as sharp as it had been during my peak intelligence days. I stopped waiting for someone to save me and decided to become my own savior, preparing for the moment I would finally break through the silence. The turning point came when I caught the attention of Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a legendary retired military defense attorney who occasionally reviewed high-profile appellate cases for anomalies. He didn't take on many clients, but something about the absolute, clinical perfection of the digital evidence against me raised flags in his experienced mind. When he first sat across from me in the visitation room, he didn't ask if I was innocent. He simply opened a massive laptop and began showing me the original forensic logs from my trial. Together we pored over the code for hours. With my background in intelligence and his deep understanding of military law, we formed an unstoppable team. Marcus managed to secure the raw, unedited backup servers from the regional command center, data the original defense team had failed to subpoena. As we dug deeper into the metadata, the breakthrough we had been praying for finally materialized. The digital signature used to authorize the classified data leak hadn't been generated from my office terminal, nor had it been uploaded while I was on duty. Someone had remotely accessed my laptop via a hidden virtual private network protocol, mirroring my identity perfectly. Even more shocking, the timestamps on the remote access logs perfectly matched the weekends I had been away on mandatory field exercises. While I was out in the mud training junior officers, someone had been sitting comfortably in my home, using my personal network to ruin my life. Marcus looked at me, his sharp eyes filled with a mixture of grim satisfaction and intense gravity. We finally had the undeniable proof that the entire case against me was a meticulously planned, digitally fabricated frame job. The invisible enemy who had engineered my downfall had left behind a distinct digital footprint, and Marcus was already tracking it directly back to its source. With the digital footprint in hand, Marcus didn't stop there. He launched a deep dive into the financial records, following the paper trail that had been generated the exact moment I was locked away. What he uncovered was a chilling testament to pure greed. The power of attorney I had signed in that frantic visitation room hadn't been used to protect my assets at all. Instead, David had systematically wiped out my personal savings accounts, moving every single dollar into a newly established corporate account. When Marcus tracked the registration of that shell company, the true depth of the betrayal left me breathless. The co-owner listed on the official documents wasn't a business partner or a broker. It was Clara. But their financial strip mining of my life didn't end with my savings. Within 3 months of my conviction, our family home, the house my parents had helped me buy, the place filled with my memories, had been legally transferred. David had sold the property to Clara for a fraction of its actual market value, and then immediately moved in with her as a co-owner, effectively erasing my name from the deed entirely. They had treated my wrongful conviction like a corporate hostile takeover, dividing up my life like vultures before the ink on my sentencing papers was even dry. Watching the dates and numbers line up on Marcus's legal pads made my stomach turn. Every letter David had sent me during that first year, filled with false tears and empty promises of loyalty, had been written from the very desk I bought, paid for by the money they had stolen from me. They believed that a military prisoner had no voice, no power, and no way to fight back from inside a cell. They were entirely confident that their tracks were covered by the legal documents I had blindly signed, completely unaware that Marcus was building a financial trap that would snap shut the moment I walked out the gate. The official overturn of my conviction happened in a closed military hearing, far away from the public eye. When the High Court reviewed the undeniable proof of the remote network manipulation and the fraudulent asset transfers, they didn't just reverse the verdict. They completely vacated the original charges. The military command offered me a formal apology, recognizing the catastrophic failure of the initial investigation. But instead of letting the news break immediately through standard administrative channels, Marcus and I requested a temporary stay on the public release of the court's decision. I wanted my record cleared, but I also wanted absolute silence. I needed the people who had engineered my downfall to remain entirely secure in their arrogance, believing their perfect crime was still completely intact. The day I walked out of the correctional facility, I wore a simple civilian jacket over my clothes. There were no cameras, no announcements, and no welcoming committees waiting for me at the gates. The transition from prisoner back to citizen was seamless, quiet, and deeply calculated. I spent my first 48 hours of freedom sitting in a modest hotel room with Marcus, reviewing the final execution of our counter-strategy. While David and Clara believed I was still sitting in a concrete cell counting down the remaining years of my sentence, we were quietly securing the legal warrants and financial freezes that would dismantle their entire lives. Every single asset they thought they had stolen was being mapped out, prepared for immediate reclamation. Choosing to keep my release a complete secret was the hardest part of the plan, but it was absolutely necessary. I had spent 3 long years being blindsided by the people I loved most, trapped in a nightmare I never saw coming. Now the tables were completely turned. I was the one moving in the shadows, armed with the truth and backed by the full weight of the legal system. As I packed my small bag and prepared to head toward the house that used to be mine, I felt no hesitation, no fear, and no doubt. The quiet storm was finally ready to break, and I was about to walk right into the center of it. Stepping past David into the foyer felt like walking into a twisted, distorted mirror of my past. I didn't stop to look at his trembling hands or the way his eyes stared frantically toward Clara, who remained frozen at the end of the hallway. Instead, I walked straight into the living room, my boots leaving damp tracks on the expensive hardwood floor. I took a slow, deliberate breath, taking in the changes they had made to my space. The framed photographs of our wedding day that used to line the mantel had been completely removed, replaced by modern abstract art pieces that looked cold and sterile. The cozy, patterned sofa we had picked out together was gone, traded for a sleek leather couch that matched Clara's upscale tastes. They had systematically erased every single physical trace of my existence from this house, treating my home like a blank canvas to build their new life upon. I watched the rain beat heavily against the large bay window, the same window where I used to sit and read on Sunday mornings before my world shattered. Clara finally found her feet, her silk robe rustling as she took a few tentative steps into the living room, her hands clutching the fabric tightly around her waist as if it could protect her from the reality standing in front of her. David followed closely behind her, his initial shock slowly giving way to a desperate, defensive calculation as he tried to figure out how a woman serving a lengthy prison sentence was suddenly standing in his pristine living room. I turned around slowly to face them, leaning casually against the back of the leather sofa. The silence between the three of us was deafening, filled with the weight of 3 years of unspoken lies and hidden greed. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, and I didn't demand an immediate explanation. The absolute, unshakable calm in my demeanor seemed to unnerve them far more than an outburst of anger ever would have. I simply looked at the two people I had trusted with my life, observing the sheer panic radiating off their skin as they realized the carefully constructed illusion they had built over the last 3 years was beginning to crack at the very foundation. David cleared his throat, trying to force his voice into a familiar mold of authority. He stepped forward, adjusting his sweater as his panic transformed into defensive anger. "Olivia, you can't just barge in here like this," he said, his tone sharpening as he tried to regain control of the room. "I don't know how you got out early or what kind of furlough you're on, but you need to leave. This isn't your house anymore. You signed the papers yourself, legally and willingly. You're a convicted felon, Olivia. Your military career is completely over and your reputation is completely ruined. You have no legal rights to this property, no claim to any money, and absolutely no business being here in the middle of the night." Clara nodded rapidly behind him, her pale face tightening as she found her voice. She crossed her arms tightly over the silk robe, trying to project a sense of ownership. "He's right, Olivia," she chimed in, her voice dripping with a synthetic cold confidence. "We felt terrible about what happened to you, we really did. I cried for weeks after the sentencing. But life moves on and we had to move on too. You're living in the past. If you start making a scene or causing trouble, we will call the local police immediately. Who do you think the authorities are going to believe? A disgraced former intelligence officer who was locked away for stealing government secrets, or 2 upstanding citizens protecting their own home? You're completely broke, you have nothing left, and no one is going to listen to a word you say." They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of arrogance and denial. They truly believed that the legal system they had manipulated to frame me would continue to shield them from the consequences of their actions. They thought they could intimidate me with the same old threats, entirely confident that my conviction made me powerless, completely blind to the fact that the entire foundation of their stolen life had already been dissolved behind their backs. I listened to their threats without moving a muscle, a small, cold smile forming on my lips. The absolute certainty in their voices was almost pitiful. They still thought they were holding all the cards, entirely unaware that the game had ended the moment I stepped off that military transport. I took a slow step toward the fireplace mantel, running my finger along the polished wood where my life used to be displayed. David's hand instantly moved toward his pocket, reaching for his phone to follow through on his threat to call the police. I didn't even turn around to look at him as I spoke, my voice cutting through the tense air of the living room with absolute clinical precision. "Go ahead and dial them, David," I said softly, turning back to face them. "But before you do, you might want to understand exactly who you're calling. Because the local police won't help you and the military court certainly won't protect you anymore. 48 hours ago, a high military tribunal officially overturned my conviction. The charges have been completely vacated, my rank has been fully restored, and my record is entirely clear. The digital evidence you two meticulously fabricated to frame me was thoroughly dismantled by forensic experts. And do you know what that means for the power of attorney you used to strip my bank accounts?" I walked right up to them, stopping just inches away from where they stood shoulder to shoulder. The smug, defensive arrogance that had filled David's face just a moment ago instantly withered away, replaced by a sudden, dawning terror. Clara took a sharp breath, her hands trembling so violently that the silk fabric of her robe rustled loudly in the quiet room. "It means every single document I signed under the duress of your fraud is legally null and void," I whispered, looking straight into my husband's panicked eyes. "This house, the money you transferred into your shell company, the life you built on my ruin, it doesn't belong to you. It never did. You didn't inherit a legacy, David. You just spent 3 years sitting in a trap I was quietly waiting to spring." Right on cue, the heavy front door swung open again, cutting off David's attempts to find a response. The cold rain swept into the foyer as Marcus Thorne stepped inside, his sharp civilian suit perfectly dry under a large umbrella. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood 3 uniformed officers from the Military Criminal Investigation Division, alongside a local police sergeant. The sudden influx of law enforcement filled the small hallway, instantly shifting the atmosphere from a tense family argument to a formal criminal raid. David took a step back, his phone slipping from his fingers and clattering loudly onto the hardwood floor. Clara let out a soft gasp, retreating until her back hit the living room wall, her eyes darting between the badges and the stern, unyielding expressions of the investigators. Marcus didn't waste a single second on pleasantries. He stepped forward into the light of the chandelier, pulling a thick packet of sealed legal documents from his leather briefcase. "David Vance, Clara Higgins," he announced, his voice carrying the booming, authoritative weight of a seasoned trial lawyer. "My name is Marcus Thorne and I am representing Captain Olivia Vance. I am serving you with a federal asset freeze and an immediate property seizure order issued by the High Court. Every single account connected to your names, including the shell corporation you established to hide stolen funds, has been locked by the Treasury Department as of 20 minutes ago. You no longer have access to a single dime of the money you illegally transferred." Before either of them could utter a word of protest, the lead CID investigator stepped forward, holding up a brightly colored warrant sticker. "Furthermore," the officer stated firmly, "we are executing a search and seizure warrant for all electronic devices on these premises. Laptops, desktop computers, external hard drives, and personal cellular phones." He gestured to the tech technicians waiting by the door. "Every device will be confiscated immediately for forensic analysis to trace the specific IP protocol addresses used to execute the original data manipulation framework against Captain Vance. Your time to cover your tracks has officially expired." The technicians moved through the house with clinical efficiency, unplugging the router, boxing up the laptops, and bagging the phones. David stood frozen as an officer took his cell phone right out of his hand. Clara began to sob openly, the reality of their situation finally breaking through her denial. The quiet confidence they had displayed just minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, suffocating panic. They looked at each other, but the silent communication they had relied on for 3 years was broken. There were no more secrets to share, only the looming certainty of their own destruction. Marcus stepped up to the dining table, laying out a series of printed server logs and digital matching protocols that left no room for interpretation. "We didn't just find the virtual network you used, David," Marcus said, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "We found the exact hardware MAC addresses from the devices inside this house. The digital footprints match your personal computer perfectly. You left a trail of breadcrumbs straight to your own front door. We have the logs showing every single time you logged into Captain Vance's secure military profile while she was away on duty, and we have the financial records showing the immediate cash transfers that followed each data breach." The lead investigator stepped closer to David, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his utility belt with a metallic click. The defense they had built over the last 3 years, the belief that the perfect crime would protect them forever, had completely collapsed in a matter of minutes. Every lie they had told, every document they had forged, and every dollar they had stolen had been tracked, logged, and prepared for the prosecution. I stood by the doorway, watching their faces drain of life as the investigators began reading them their formal rights. They had spent 3 long years believing they had successfully erased me from existence, never imagining that the data they used to destroy my life would ultimately be the very thing that sealed their own fate. The handcuffs clicked loudly as the officers secured David's wrists behind his back. He didn't look at me, keeping his head bowed as his shoulders slumped in total defeat. Clara followed right behind him, her hands trembling inside the plastic restraints, her face entirely streaked with tears as she desperately tried to pull the silk robe tightly around herself. The local police sergeant and the military investigators escorted them down the long hallway, their boots echoing heavily against the wood before they stepped out into the dark night. I walked out onto the covered porch, leaning against the damp wooden railing as I watched the red and blue emergency lights slice through the pouring rain, painting the driveway in brilliant, flashing colors. They were placed into the backs of separate patrol cars, the doors slamming shut with a heavy final thud that signaled the end of their freedom. The engines revved and the vehicles slowly pulled away down the circular driveway, their tail lights disappearing into the dark, wet street. The silence that followed their departure was absolute, broken only by the steady rhythmic sound of the rain drumming against the roof of the porch. For 3 long years, a crushing weight had sat squarely on my chest, a suffocating mixture of confusion, isolation, and the agonizing pain of a betrayal I couldn't understand. But as the last patrol car turned the corner and vanished from sight, that weight finally lifted, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. The house was completely empty now, stripped of the thieves who had tried to claim it as their own. I stood alone in the cool night air, taking a deep, clean breath of the rain-washed atmosphere. The nightmare that had started in a cold military courtroom was finally over. The truth had been completely uncovered, and the legal system had finally executed a perfect, unyielding reckoning. I turned back toward the open front door of my home, no longer a prisoner, no longer a victim, but an officer who had successfully fought her way back from the dark. Reclaiming my life was a meticulous, step-by-step process that required the same discipline I had learned in the military. In the weeks that followed that fateful rainy night, Marcus and I worked tirelessly to untangle the financial knot David and Clara had left behind. With the court order in hand, the banks quickly unfrozen my stolen savings, restoring every single dollar to my name. The fraudulent deed on my house was legally dissolved, restoring my sole ownership of the property. I hired a team to clear out every piece of furniture, every painting, and every cold, modern decoration they had brought into my space, donating it all to local charities. I wanted a clean slate, a home that belonged completely to my future rather than the ghosts of my past. Meanwhile, the military command followed through on their promises. I received a formal written apology from the highest levels of the intelligence branch, acknowledging the oversight that had led to my wrongful conviction. My back pay for the 3 years I had spent wrongfully imprisoned was deposited into my account, and I was offered a promotion to major along with full reinstatement into active duty. It was everything I had spent years dreaming about while staring at the concrete walls of my cell. Yet as I sat in the clean, empty living room of my restored home, looking over the official military paperwork, I realized that the woman who had walked out of that correctional facility wasn't the same 25-year-old captain who had entered it. I had changed. The betrayal had burned away my old naivety, leaving behind a sharp, unshakable understanding of the civilian legal system and the vulnerabilities of digital infrastructure. I decided to decline the reinstatement offer, choosing instead to pivot my security clearance and intelligence training into a new career path as a high-level corporate consultant, helping organizations protect themselves from the very kind of internal fraud and digital manipulation that had nearly destroyed me. I was no longer just recovering what was lost. I was building a brand new empire on my own terms. Now, sitting on the porch of my new home in a quiet coastal town, I look out at the horizon where the ocean meets the sky. The air is fresh, crisp, and entirely mine. The past 3 years taught me that the people who claim to love you the most can sometimes be the ones most envious of your light. But they also taught me that resilience isn't just about surviving the storm. It's about learning how to navigate through the dark until you find the shore. David and Clara wanted to erase me, but in their greed, they only managed to reveal the strength I never knew I possessed. I rebuilt my life out of the ashes of their betrayal, and today I am stronger, wealthier, and more at peace than I have ever been. Now, I have a question for all of you watching my story today. If you walked through your front door after years away and found the 2 people you trusted most living your life, what would you have done? Would you have walked away quietly, or would you have fought for justice the way I did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I really want to see how you would handle a betrayal this deep. And while you're down there, don't forget to comment the city you are watching from so I can see just how far my journey has reached across the world. If this story reminded you to stay strong in the face of adversity, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next dramatic story. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. I am leaving 2 other incredible stories on the screen right now that I know will absolutely surprise you. Take care, and I will see you in the next video.